So why wouldn't you tell stories? Why wouldn't you make the customer the hero in your journey rather than making yourself the center of it? These are things that will naturally draw people in and create some interest in what you're sharing with them.
Well, I can for sure say it's the first time that Iliad and foibles has been said on Radical Content. You are definitely elevating the show a lot here today, Scott, which I knew was going to happen. Hey, everybody, it's Eric Gray. Welcome again to another episode of Radical Content. I am super pumped to have my guest today, Scott Monty. There's so much that I could say about Scott. Right now he's the CEO and principal for Scott Monty Strategies. You can check out everything at scottmonty.com. We'll talk a little about that. But if you go way back to 2014 and then even prior to that, the global head of social media and digital communications for Ford Motor Company. But more importantly, we've got a chance to talk and become friends a little bit over the years. And so I'm super pumped to have you here, but you're not wearing a bow tie. It's like I don't even know who you are anymore. Scott, what is going on?
Come on. See, when you so firmly associate your identity with one thing and you move that one thing, it's completely off-putting for people. But look, I am a purveyor of fine men's neckwear, whether it's the bow or the necktie category. I wear both. The challenge is once you wear a bow tie, even one time, you instantly become framed in people's minds as the bow tie guy.
Yeah, it's your brand. Yeah, that's for sure.
So I thought I'd move away and just give myself a little more versatility. A lot of times I'll choose a tie, a pattern based on something that's going on in the news, in the national consciousness, or in history. And I just like to keep people on their toes that way.
Well, good. Well, we'll take whatever version of Scott Monty we can get because we've really enjoyed. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the years. So we talked a little bit about what this show is about, and we're really wanting to help people, Fortune 1000, Fortune 500, figure out how can they tell stories, connect better. And I know your career has evolved, but you spent a lot of time helping brands understand the value of social when no one really knew what we were doing when it came to brand building. Where do you feel like you first kind of caught that bug for branded content and storytelling? I mean, I think before we were talking off the air, you said you were podcasting back in 2007. So this has kind of been a part of you. Where do you think that kind of started for you?
Well, it probably goes back to even childhood, but certainly in my college days. I was a classics major as an undergrad. And that's not something you hear about all that frequently, certainly not from corporate social media folks and not from terribly many people in the business world. But thinking back to those years of studying history and drama and architecture and just the stories of civilization, you realize that human nature is constant and that we're still feeling the same kinds of feelings, the same frustrations, the same highs and lows and successes that we've seen throughout all human history. It's just, our surroundings have changed, our technology has changed, our way of talking with each other has changed. And you think about even Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey. What were those? That was oral history. It was storytelling. It was hundreds of years before those were actually written down. I mean, think about how long it takes you to get a transcript. Right? So Homer was telling stories around the fire, and then people were passing these stories down to generation and generation to talk about things like anger and hubris and pride and all of the foibles and the successes of humans, right? So it's been ingrained in us as people for a long time. So when it comes to marketing and communications, what are we doing? We're connecting with the emotions of other people and using those emotions to move something forward. So why wouldn't you tell stories? Why wouldn't you make the customer the hero in your journey rather than making yourself the center of it? These are things that will naturally draw people in and create some interest in what you're sharing with them.
Well, I can for sure say it's the first time that Iliad and foibles has been said on Radical Content. You are definitely elevating the show a lot here today, Scott, which I knew was going to happen. And I so appreciate it because it's such a it's such an interesting perspective, right? The idea that storytelling has existed forever and it's been a communication device to break through, to connect, and to not just communicate something in the moment, but to pass down messages or perceptions or feelings for, in some ways, kind of generations at times. And so I love that broader thinking than I probably expected today, but I'm ready for it. So let's keep going. Let's keep going with that. So with that thinking in mind, you're brought into the Ford Motor Company, right? This is early 2010.
2008.
You're brought in as an exec. Oh, 2008. Perfect. Thank you. You're brought in as an executive level to help this company, which has been around for a while. I don't know where the socioeconomic world was with the Ford Motor Company at the time, but you really brought a new, fresh perspective, and we can talk a little bit about some of the things that you did. But tell me, why were you brought in? What was that challenge to do for Ford Motor Company? And the reason why I want to start there today is I want to, as we go through this conversation, kind of take a look at like, that's where we were when we were figuring out brand storytelling for these digital channels. And we'll transition as we get through this chat to talk about where we are today. And are we satisfied with where we are, or is there still a long way to go? But let's talk about Ford. What were you brought in for, and what sparked even that need for the
So think
Ford
about
Motor Company?
2006, 2007. We were at the early days of social media, the very earliest days. Twitter had just begun, in early 2006. It really didn't come into its own until 2007. Companies didn't have Facebook pages until 2008 or so. Really, YouTube and corporate blogging were the only things that we knew in terms of social media.
Right.
Ford's major competitor, GM, had been doing stuff in the blogosphere and with YouTube, and sometimes to their detriment. But Ford's chief communications officer looked at that and said, we need to get up on this. We need to get educated. We need somebody to lead these efforts at an executive level, and we need to be strategic about it. So they contacted me. I had been working in an advertising agency and then with a strategic consultancy that just did social media strategy for big brands. I was working with American Airlines and Panasonic and some other big brands to help them understand how to harness the power of social, how to think about it strategically for their organization. And it was largely expressed through communications and marketing, but ultimately that strategic level adoption would spread throughout the entire organization if done well. So Ford contacted me at the end of 2007. They were about a year into a new CEO, a guy by the name of Alan Mulally, who came from a 3+ decades career at Boeing. And Alan was the first non-automotive CEO that Ford had. Right now, remember, Ford is still a family-owned company. It's public, but the majority of shares are owned by the Ford family. And Ford itself, the name on the logo is the name of the founder. It's a very human-driven organization. Henry Ford was associated with the company for its first 40 years, right? So they said, we need to start getting serious about things again. Ford in 2006 took out a $26 billion home improvement loan, shall we say. They leveraged the company.
Corporate home improvement
they leveraged
loan.
the company
really nice.
for what they needed to do, to put money into product development, to take the plan that Alan had, this one Ford plan, and to fund it and bring it to life. And Alan's vision was to make the company profitable by 2009, right? So I get contact at the end of 2007, right? And I was working, again, for this strategic consultancy. We were all remote. We were using Skype and AOL Messenger and Second Life, even back then.
Ahead of your time, Scott.
So my first question was, interesting position, fascinating development here. Do I have to move to Detroit? I was living in Boston at the time, and they go, yeah, this is kind of a serious gig. It's an executive level position. We need you here at the world headquarters. And I go, not interested. And you could have heard a pin drop. And the chief communications officer said,
"Poor Detroit, just getting kicked in the
I know,
face."
right? He could have gone any number of ways with this. He could have said, "How dare you, sir? Do you know who you're talking with?"
Right.
What he did say
Right.
was, "Are you sure?" And I said, the timing just doesn't feel right for me. But the seed was planted in my head at that point, and I started hearing more and more about Ford over time. And what I found in the spring of 2008 is Ford had filed its Q1 earnings. Guess what? $100 million profit. I go, maybe there is something to this. Maybe this company is actually on a comeback, right? Because Ford was not held in great esteem by the public in late 2007. So we got back in touch. They said, you know what? We still haven't filled the position. We've talked to about 50 people. Your name keeps coming up. Would you at least humor us and come out to Dearborn? Okay, fine. So went through a battery of interviews, and with every person I met, I was struck with their intelligence, their talent, and most importantly, their passion. Right? There was something going on at that company that fueled that passion. You can't fake that, right? So I said, where do I sign up?
Yeah.
So I joined on July 14th. And the reason I remember that date, July 14th, 2008, is because exactly 10 days later, Eric, the company had its Q2 earnings. And this time, it was a slightly different story. $8.7 billion in the hole. The company's largest quarterly loss ever. So I called my wife back in Boston. I said, don't finish packing. I may be back before the summer is out. But what we did, and that's right when the carpocalypse started, when the whole global financial and automotive meltdown started.
Yeah.
We just dug in and we kept telling the Ford story. We even propped up a site called thefordstory.com, where we had a chance to share with the public what our plans have been, what we've been doing over the last 2 years with all this money that we've had, and why we don't need the government help, even though we were there in Congress with our two competitors, with GM and Chrysler at the time. We were there to help support the entire industry, and everyone was going to succeed. And my view was that by the time Ford began to recover, and by the time I thought the social media industry was going where it should, by 2010, there should be this kind of cross breeze intersection where the two would just ignite each other and Ford would be way out in front. And that's exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting about what was happening at the time is you had some leadership that had a point of view about where this has to go in an area that was still unknown. So tell me a little bit, what were those conversations like internally? How did the brand think about the importance of engaging customers and building fans in these channels that were so new at the time?
Yeah, we had a lot of support from Alan Mulally as the CEO, because his whole thing with the One Ford plan was creating transparency in the company, right? Sharing information rather than hoarding it. And that's exactly what we were doing on social media as marketers and communicators at the time. We were sharing our successes. We were sharing how we did things. It was the spirit of conversation. And the other thing was Alan's plan was about working together, right? You share this information in the spirit of transparency, but you use it to actually collaborate and get things done rather than to do things in silos. So it was a direct strategic connection with what we needed to do. And having Alan involved, in December of 2008, we were at a media event where we were previewing some of our vehicles for the auto show for next month with business and automotive press. And I was there on my BlackBerry at the time. We were still on corporate BlackBerries, tweeting about what I was seeing. Bill Ford and Alan Mulally walking into the room together. OMG, right? Somebody in my timeline said, hey, why don't you see if you can get Alan to answer some questions for us here on Twitter? And I go, oh my God, that's the kind of idea I wish I had come up with myself, but it's a perfect example of why the community is smarter than any single individual, right? And we leaned into community while I was at Ford. So I went up to Alan. He's like, hey, Scott, how's it going? I'm like, great, Alan. Would you be willing to answer some questions now on Twitter? And he goes, oh, yeah, absolutely. What's Twitter? And I go, see, the guy, he has the spirit of wanting to engage, of wanting to share, wanting to listen, right? So we get through all of that. And the last question, I'll never forget the last question. Somebody asked, what kind of car does Alan drive? And I turned to his handler because I'm like, is this like a security breach? I don't want to get anybody in trouble.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And she goes, watch this. I go, all right, Alan, what kind of car do you drive? And he grabs me by the forearm and he kind of shakes it with every word. He goes, I drive a different car every day. And I go, oh, it's fantastic. You experience the whole Ford lineup. And he squeezes harder at that point. And he goes, no, I drive the competition. And you could have knocked me over with a feather at that point, Eric, because here I was, a guy from Boston, so myopic, so thinking that Detroit was only interested in Detroit and ignored the rest of the world. And boy, Alan just gave a master class in how you appreciate a strategic advantage, how you appreciate what your competition is doing and what you need to be doing, right? So
the other thing that comes to mind from that is, and I'll let you kind of close that and finish it up, is just this mindset of being okay with not focusing just on your logo and just on your brand to tell a larger story, which even today people still struggle
and it's
with.
important because the world doesn't only experience life through your brand. They have all kinds of things. I've often said, when someone wakes up first thing in the morning, they're not thinking about your brand, unless you're, Starbucks or, their favorite coffee. They have other priorities in their life. And if you can't put yourself in their shoes by using empathy, by, talking with people and listening, doing a lot of listening, right? We have two ears and one mouth. Use them in that proportion. It's something that Socrates said thousands of years ago. Not your grandmother, even though your grandmother was smart, right? We've all heard that. 2 ears, 1 mouth. Companies need to take that to heart because that helps inform what you should be talking about. It helps inform what people are going to find interesting. And immediately, Alan realized that. He realized that this is a two-way conversation. And that it's not just us blasting our message at people. It's using our listening skills to understand exactly what they want to be talking about.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about that? Way early on, Ford was listening, going to the people, and building community and being willing to kind of say the thing that they didn't want to say. And what's funny is I actually wonder how much of that seeded things. And I'm sure you're aware of this. In 2023, the new Ford CEO, Jim Farley, went across America to kind of, test and talk about the Ford F-150 Lightning electric vehicle. And it's just funny to me to think about, like, that campaign is a little bit of a wink at what you guys were doing way back in the late 2009.
Yeah, well, Jim was the CMO while I was there. He and I worked closely together.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
He understood it. Right. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Before I do, I want to mention that this is ironic since Ford's founder, Henry Ford, very famously said that the customer could get any color car that they wanted as long as it was black. He thought the idea, the throwaway idea there is that he thought he knew better. The reality is that Ford had to be making cars at such a fast clip to supply the needs of America and really the world at that time. They only used black paint because it was the fastest drying paint. Right? It allowed them to meet the volume. The reality is, up until then, Fords came in a rainbow of colors. But Henry Ford, of course, is famous for saying that we'll tell you what you need. Or if I asked the customer what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. That's the other one, right?
Yeah. Heard that
but
one. Yeah.
With Jim, right, Jim had come from a family of Ford engineers and frontline workers and had Ford in his blood since he was a kid. So he comes back to Ford from Toyota after many years, became the CMO, and under his leadership, that's when we did the Fiesta movement. This was taking Alan's vision of one Ford, right? Same kind of cars all around the world, using our engineering, product design, marketing skills in one area and creating a single car. So the focus, for example, would be the same all around the world. Here in the United States, for anybody who had rented a crappy Focus up until that time. They envied the Foci that they were driving in Europe. And so with the Fiesta, which was a smaller car than the Focus, we just missed the window on that universal design. So what the company did under Jim's leadership is we brought over 100 European-styled Fiestas, which would be eventually available in the United States after a year's delay after the European launch. Brought 100 of those Fiestas here. We gave them to 100 influencers. They weren't called influencers back then. They were people who had blogs and YouTube channels and Flickr channels, right? This was before Instagram. Yeah. And we would give them the car for 6 months and let them do whatever they wanted to do. All their commitment to Ford was a single video every month. So they only had to make 6 videos for Ford with ownership of a car for 6 months. And guess what? They were all across the country, driving it around, showing it off, and of course, doing all the other extra content development for their audiences that showed off the car because they were proud of it. They wanted to share an experience that nobody else had in their area. And then the genius was Ford took all of those RSS feeds of all of their content and dumped it into a website and didn't touch it. It was all unedited, unfiltered, real time, real people talking about a real vehicle. That took a lot of courage and took a lot of confidence in where Ford was going. But we also used it as an opportunity to listen to what they were telling us and make some tweaks along the way.
Yeah, you're jumping ahead in my list of questions because the Ford Fiesta movement campaign was, I think, the first, what I would call kind of social media influencer campaign at a very large scale. It was giving literally the keys to the customer to kind of get their point of view and to kind of let them go. I remember, and if people have been in social media for, less than 10 years, then you might not know of it. But I remember back in the day, it was like, you guys got so much pub for this. Like it was everywhere. Any marketing keynote, people were talking about the Fiesta campaign as like the example. But here's the thing I wanted to ask you about it, because at the end of the day, yes, it's using kind of new mechanisms. These are social media influencers, bloggers. What if we gave them the keys? What if we let them roam around and take photos? We curate them on a website. Today, all of those ideas sound, still cool, but not, completely different. But in that moment, there was such extreme creativity to say, no, there's a new way to reach people. Yeah, we can do ads and yeah, we can do this, but what's some other way that we can reach people in an authentic way? And to me, that is the insight there, that the people at Ford, you, the team, the leadership, were open to new and creative ideas, which sometimes I think hamstrings people today, especially in the world of performance marketing, especially in the world of having every dollar connected back to a return on investment, which I get. Look, I understand is very important to make sure that marketing is not a cost center, but it's actually producing overall revenue for the business, and you can measure it. But it was such a bet, and it's something that I've always looked back on. I probably had it in some decks back in the day. Where did that idea come from at Ford?
Well, this is a wonderful example of that spirit of collaboration, of working together. This was a Ford and its agencies, kind of collaborating on this idea. It had a wonderful, supportive, creative genius of a marketing agency that we use. It's now known as I think Global Team Blue, GTB. Used to be Team Detroit, which was an amalgamation of a number of like Ogilvy and J. Walter Thompson and the traditional agencies. So they came to Ford with the idea. We collaborated on it. We, improved it along the way, made tweaks, and ultimately, we were able to tie it to specific vehicle reservations, right? Because there was no other way to get information about the Fiesta at the time. 132,000 vehicle reservations for this little car that was only available in Europe. It was a massive, massive success.
Yeah. So I kind of teased this question out earlier, so I'll get to it now. in the 2008s and 2009s, you guys were out in front doing amazing, amazing things. It's now 2024, and we definitely still are seeing some big social activations, especially in the worlds of sports and entertainment. But, social media has just kind of, in content and storytelling, these kind of new, innovative ways of doing things has kind of, just shifted over the years. Where do you see it today when you talk to brands? How do you look at this as a mechanism for brands to connect and to build the brand versus kind of, just the interruptive idea of pushing messages on people? Where do you see it today compared to where it was in 2010?
Well, I think it's certainly a lot more marketing dominated. I saw this happen over time while I was at Ford, that, my position resided within corporate communications, which made a lot of sense at the time. It was kind of the nerve center of everything that happened within Ford. They say if corporate communications didn't know about it, it wasn't happening, right? We were that nerve center to the inside and the outside of the company. We had a good strategic read on our messaging. We were directly reporting into the CEO. Our boss reports to the CEO, not to the chief marketing officer. So there was kind of a parallel here. But what happened with social media at Ford, as with most companies, is it became very budget driven, and the budgets are really controlled by marketing, about a 10x of the budget that you get from a corporate communications team. So with that, we kind of ceded control of social media to the marketing team, and it became more of programmatic. It became more ad driven. It became more broadcast than community development. And that's just the way it was. It wasn't something that I necessarily wanted to see happen, but to scale it, that's where they thought they needed to go. And I think that's continued to this day. You continue to see a lot of this broadcast. However, there are brands that still appreciate that dialogue, that back and forth, that listening. And you see it through some of the snarky stuff, like from a Wendy's or Steak-umm, or, any of these brands that have a personality on their social channels. And that can cut one of two ways. Either people can really like it, or it can really turn them off. But it certainly sets them apart. It's not just vanilla flavored engagement or vanilla flavored marketing. I think the challenge right now that's different than what we were experiencing back in that heyday is there are fewer new platforms entering the scene. Every time there was a new way of communicating, a new way of engaging people, we would try it out at Ford. Some of them were abject failures. Some of them were great successes. But that notion of having something new and different to try and to apply your storytelling to it was fascinating for people. So what you've got now is I think there's a lot more stability in terms of the platforms and the places we tell our stories. But we're seeing people get back to some of the basics. We're actually seeing an embrace we have over the last 3 years of newsletters, right? And even of blogs at this point, where you're seeing people go back to the tried and true with what always worked. And ironically, in some ways, that's actually helping them stand apart, right? And we firmly believe this at Ford. We would zig when other people were zagging. We paved the road behind us. We didn't pay attention to what our competition was doing. We just did what was right for us and for our community. And I think that's something that I always counsel brands on, is to know where your audience is, to know how they consume information or how they'd be willing to consume information, and to have fun with it and be human beneath it all, because that's what connects people with you.
Yeah, and we're still seeing those brands pop up today. You mentioned a couple. I'd mentioned people like Liquid Death or Duolingo. So how do you advise brands today, right? When you're coming in, you have a much broader perspective on the full funnel of marketing, the full mix of all the channels. But to me, my point of view has always been, and the kind of the point of view of this show, is that engagement and storytelling is underinvested. We do a lot of things at the top of the funnel to yell, and then we try to bring people down into selling. And this this wooing phase, this engagement phase is still something that predominantly is underinvested. They've got smaller teams. They've got interns and more junior people doing things. They've got 10 people wearing 10 hats, or 2 people wearing 10 hats, rather than doing what some of these people, I mean, the Duolingo case studies are insane. And their CMO kind of out and talks about the millions of dollars of consistent subscription revenue that has happened because of the awareness of how they've optimized those channels. So how do you sit down in front of a CMO and say something along the lines of, like, there's opportunity here, but you got to be willing to actually go into it and invest?
Yeah. The work I do now is primarily with executives and how they show up,
Sure.
rather than the full brand content team.
Right.
But that was born out of working with executives at Ford to understand what mattered to them. Right? I was in a meeting, it was early on, 2010, 2011 maybe, to give a kind of state of the industry with respect to social media in service of trying to get more funding for what we were doing. And,
Sure.
and the ask was to the CFO. Now, up until then, our CFO had been our biggest skeptic. He was the kind
Sure.
of guy, he was a dour accountant type, that, if he sucked a lemon, it would probably improve his outlook on things and improve his face. He was that kind of guy. However, I knew that there was a certain way that he thought about things as well. So I went to the Thunderbird room where Ford had its weekly business plan review meetings. It was like this giant Dr. Strangelove room of giant circular table with the overhead lights. Every executive that reported to the CEO was there, and I was sitting shoulder to shoulder between the CFO and the COO. And I had to give a state of the industry on social media and how Ford was doing and the rest. I started the meeting by going to our corporate Twitter account and posing a question to our audience that I knew would not only affect the CFO, but would affect every single executive around the room. Because back in those days, we were really concerned about fuel economy, as was the public. This was the early days of electric vehicles. People wanted to see how far they could get. Gas prices were up, etc. So I said, what's the minimum MPG you need to see from your next vehicle when you make a purchase? And I hit send out to our Twitter audience. And I went and I gave the presentation, and it was fine. I said, all right, let's go back to that Twitter account at the end of that presentation and let's see what the responses were. And there were a couple hundred responses, right? And they were all over the place, from, don't matter what the MPG is, as long as we had a V8 engine in it, all the way up to 300 miles per gallon, which is kind of the electric equivalent.
Yeah.
And most of the responses were in the 30s and 40s miles per gallon, which is exactly where Ford had targeted its fleet over the next 3 years. So it kind of validated our strategy. But I looked over to my left to Lewis, our CFO, and he took his glasses off and he put them up on his forehead and he goes, do you know, if I had insights like this every day, I would find it invaluable. And I thought, well, game, set, and match, ladies and gentlemen. I've just found the use case for the CFO, right? So I'm speaking his language, right? And that's what you need to do with any executive that you're in charge of when you're trying to help them understand this stuff. Well, what matters to them? What motivates them? What can they point to show that they've been successful, and then build a program around that?
Yeah. I've said a couple of things. Well, one thing I asked Seth Godin, I met him one time I like chase people down and ask them questions. And he said that exact thing. He was like, you got to find out what's important to them and you got to speak their language. The other thing I would say is that you did in this little exercise is you've got to make something that they don't understand and can be very complicated seem very simple. And so I did something kind of similar to what you did, where I was like, look, here, we can tell you all the activities we have, where our investments are, the channel impressions, and I can go through all the reports. But I pulled up one tweet that had like 250,000 impressions, and it had thousands of responses. This is when I was at Universal Parks and Resorts. And I scrolled through all the comments and saw all the fandom and the engagement and the reaction of these people opting in raising their hand to connect with a brand, a logo. And everybody in the room was like, there's something here, right? There's something here. Because it's something that you can't get anywhere else, right? You can put an ad out, you can get people's attention, you can put the right message at the right channel for the right person at the right time. Those are all really important transactional connections. But the value of a relationship with a customer through a brand is immeasurable. And if there's things you can do to expedite that and to mass scale that, that's the thing that honestly, it drives me somewhat batty in the sense that I love it, but also somewhat batty in the sense that it makes me go crazy because I see things like Savannah Bananas. And I'm like, everybody could be the Savannah Bananas. Everybody could. It's a significant investment in transparency, in entertainment, in storytelling that is just not as easy as getting a piece of, ad, putting it on display, throw it into some programmatic buying, and looking and seeing our return on investment was $3.50. That's a lot easier than being creative and being relevant and showing up and building audiences, and it drives me nuts.
Yeah, well, and I think you've hit on something there, Eric, because that's human nature. We want to go the easy route. Water will always take the fastest path to wherever it's going. Humans are the same way. And so if you are battling that, if you're battling with someone who doesn't want to put in the effort, then figure out how to get there stepwise, right? Give them an option that's fairly easy, but that gets some results, and then use that to ladder up to the next wave. Yeah. You're not going to get everybody to do a Fiesta movement from day one, right? Sure. There's got to be a culture, there's got to be an attitude there. But if you can start to build small successes, that will lead you to where you need to go.
Knowing what you knew strategically back then, and then what y'all were able to do at Ford, and seeing where the world is today with, video being such a big component, whether it's Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts, or for sure, how interest-based, for you content and TikTok has completely changed the game. What is your advice to the people that are starting to sit in the seats that you sat in 2012 and 2014 that are directors of social, about how they can, build brand? What can you take away from your time when you were doing this for people that are doing this today?
There are a couple of things that I think every marketer or communicator needs to have in their quiver. And they aren't video editing skills, they aren't writing skills, although to me, writing is the basis of every function, whether you're video, audio, or print, or giving a speech. It all starts with writing. And by the way, in order to be a good writer, you need to be a good reader first. So please keep reading. Don't just
I heard somebody say, to build on that, I heard someone say, to be a good writer, you've got to be a good thinker. In essence, you got to have original ideas, original thought, and yes, the reading, the thinking, the writing, for sure.
Well, and to think back to what we were saying before in terms of human nature and nothing new under the sun, there probably aren't any new ideas. It's how you take old ideas and reframe them to the current age, to whatever it is your particular position is. But I think the two things that every marketer, communicator, storyteller needs to have in their quiver is, number one, insatiable curiosity, right? And that comes from that reading. It's wanting to know more. It's having questions. It's being willing to explore, not being satisfied with the status quo. That's one. Number two, you have to have an inherent sense of empathy, right? You need to be able to feel like Cicero said before us, feel my feelings. You need to be able to feel what other people are feeling. You need to be able to put yourself in their shoes. And from that, from understanding what kind of content people are willing to consume, what it is that they're scrolling through, what they spend more time with, what intrigues them, what makes them more curious and want more. Those are the kinds of things you need to understand first and foremost before you embark on any new venture.
I love it. A couple things that I wanted to point out from this podcast that I just have really taken away, and you kind of said one of them there, but the idea of what you guys did it for to zig and then zag, when other people zig, when other people's there's that, I think that's really, really important. And the last thing I'll say is, you might wear a bow tie and a tie and have a traditional point of view, but damn it, Scott, you're a maverick. What you did at Ford and the way you try to tell people to think today and to think differently and to go in a different direction, it's right in line with kind of how we think and how we talk and how we're pushing brands to prop themselves up and be willing to go at it in a different way. Because when you go at it as the sea of sameness, you are ignored and you are white noise. But when you can find new ways to showing up, new creative ways to show up on these platforms, there's just a way for your brand to connect. And so, dude, it's been a pleasure today to kind of get into your head a little bit. And I know people are gonna really enjoy this episode. But I've enjoyed kind of just being able to sit here and listen along. And I could do this for a while.
Yeah, you're awesome, Eric, and to think that it started at a bookstore of all places.
It did. What a callback! What a callback! All right, so scottmonty.com if you want to check this out. He's got a podcast, Timeless Leadership. He's got a newsletter that you can get. I know I get it on LinkedIn. You can get it everywhere. He does, obviously a lot of coaching and a lot of things for many people, both in the marketing space, probably a little bit, but also a ton of leadership. As you can tell, Scott has definitely stepped into a new chapter, and I love where you're at, man. And it's just been a pleasure to get to know you. You guys don't know this, but I've had conversations with Scott when I was thinking about leaving corporate and starting my own thing. And so Scott has been a person that's been in my camp and someone I've been able to kind of connect with, and I just so appreciate it, and I appreciate the time today, man.
So proud of how far you've come, Eric, and how you've explored your own leadership and your own path. It's just been a marvel to watch from the outside. So congratulations.
I appreciate it, man. All right, another episode of Radical Content in the books. Do all the things that you're going to do for Scott for us. Like us, follow us, do all the things, and we'll continue to bring great content like this to you. All right, appreciate it, everybody. See you soon.
I'm in a sweet spot.